Major General Margaret H. Woodward served as United States Air Force pilot and commander of all U.S. and coalition air assets for the United Nations military intervention during the 2011 Libyan Civil War. Woodward entered the Air Force in 1983 and earned her pilot wings the same year. She soon found herself flying the KC-135 Stratotanker and went on to serve in a variety of operational and staff positions, to include commanding the largest tanker squadron since Vietnam while deployed in support of military operations in Kosovo. In June 2007, Woodward became the first woman to command the prestigious 89th Airlift Wing, home of Air Force One. Shortly after her promotion to Brigadier General in June 2008, Woodward became Vice Commander of the 18th Air Force. In June 2010, she took command of the 17th Air Force and U.S. Air Forces in Africa, where she managed relations with 53 countries. In early 2011, as Libya sunk deeper into civil war, Woodward and her team developed a plan for possible intervention. On March 17, 2011, the United Nations voted to enact a no-fly zone over Libya. Woodward would now execute her plan, which expanded to include 13 coalition members within the first 48 hours. On the night of March 19, 2011, Operation ODYSSEY DAWN was initiated. By the afternoon of March 20th, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff announced that the no-fly zone was effectively in place, a testament to Woodward's expertly planned and executed air campaign. In total, the devastating air campaign consisted of over 2,100 sorties and 200 cruise missile strikes, which destroyed 25% of Gaddafi's military within 2 weeks. Woodward made history by not only being the first female Combined Air Forces Air Component Commander, or CFACC, but also the first non-fighter or bomber CFACC. She was promoted to Major General on April 1, 2011, and retired April 1, 2014, with more than 4,000 hours of flight time, having flown and commanded in 9 named operations.
It's my pleasure to introduce Major General retired Maggie Woodward, interviewed by Major Lincoln Crockett.
Lincoln Crockett. Thank you.
Okay, I just have to start off by saying that Colonel Ellis set the bar so high this morning that I've just decided I'm going to limbo under the bar, okay? So just...
Well, ma'am, before we get started, I'd just like to say thank you for not only supporting ACSC, but the Gathering of Eagles Foundation. It's a privilege to have you here and an honor to be able to include you as part of this year's program, so thank you very much. So as evident by your video bio, you have a wide breadth of experience throughout your career. I'd like to focus mainly on the Operation ODYSSEY DAWN piece for this interview, for the most part. And for those of you that don't know, ODYSSEY DAWN was our intervention in Libya. To get us started, can you describe the events that took us from the Arab Spring to the initial stages of ODYSSEY DAWN?
Sure. Well, you know, obviously everything kicked off pretty quick. The Arab Spring surprised most of us. Our initial reaction was thinking that we were going to have to do some NEO non-combatant evacuation operations especially in Egypt, and we were looking at across North Africa. And I had traveled down to South Africa to do some engagement with my partners there that had been planned for over a year. And while I was down there, things got warmer and warmer, and I called back to my AFRICOM boss and I said, hey, I really think I need to come home. And he said, yeah, I think so. So I raced home, if you will, even though it's a 14-hour flight back from South Africa. And from that moment on, we were pretty much fully engaged in planning for combat operations. And starting, like I said, with the NEO, and we got some original taskings from the Joint Staff that were, you know, your typical, hey, can you do this? Can you do this? And our frustration, I think, to start with, was it wasn't just, can you institute a no-fly zone? They said, well, we want you to institute or plan to institute a no-fly zone in Libya, but we want you to do that without bombing anything, you know, or we want you to do that by just cratering the runways so the airplanes can't fly. So we spent a lot of time not just planning, building the plans that we knew were important to achieve the objectives that were going to be handed to us, or that we thought would be handed to us, but also countering some of the good ideas that were out there that we knew just wouldn't work. And so we, as a command at 17th Air Force, went into full press mode. It was a little confusing at the time because we had AFRICOM, who was responsible for Libya. Obviously, it was in our AOR, but it affected the Europeans, and the Europeans were the ones pushing so much for engagement. So EUCOM was heavily involved also, and we also knew that the basing and assets would probably be EUCOM's when the time came, if we were going to institute anything. Another complication was the fact that the expectation from most folks, including the Joint Force Commander who was put in charge of Odyssey Dawn, was that we would build the plans, but ultimately NATO would be the one that would execute. So in his mind, we were going to build the plans, hand them lock stock to the NATO commander, and the NATO commander was then going to go execute the plan. Further complicated by the fact that I'm sure most of you can get the impression from some of the rhetoric that was out there at the time, is the Department of Defense really did not want to engage. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that they did not want to have to intervene in Libya. We obviously were pretty heavily engaged in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the last thing we wanted to do was take on something else. And something as open-ended as Libya would probably be. So there was a great deal of resistance within our own department to doing anything. Where that comes into play is in our ability to get resources. So the whole process of requesting forces goes through the Joint Staff. The Joint Staff validates it, and then once the Joint Staff validates those forces, then it goes to the SecDef to sign the RFF, to give you orders. Well, the Joint Staff validated our request for forces at the very, very beginning of March. Or actually, I think it was the 28th of February, now that I think about it, that they actually validated all the forces we asked for. The Secretary of Defense did not sign even a portion. When we finally executed, we got less than 10% of the forces that we asked for. And those weren't signed until we had already had the B-2s in the air for over 6 hours. So we had to launch the B-2s on our own recognizance, basically. Me and the 8th Air Force Commander and the Vice at Stratcom also helped us. So we all kind of got together and decided, well, if we don't launch the B-2s by now, we're going to be in trouble because we won't be able to execute at this point. And the reason it was such a surprise to everybody, I think, was no one expected the UN to, Security Council to vote yes on that heavy of a resolution, especially when it talked about the responsibility to protect civilians. And if we think about it, this is the first time in history that the international community has come together and said, hey, we're going to take on the responsibility to protect civilians against their own government. And that's a huge challenge when you think about it. And I won't lie to you that it was a challenge even in my own mind. Is this something that I would really want us to do? Because it sets a pretty big precedent there. Mm-hmm. But then you also have in your mind, whether it's Rwanda or any other of the many situations that we didn't have the opportunity or we didn't choose to intervene, where you saw the devastation. And I'll tell you, I had laid a wreath at the Rwandan memorial on top of the graves of over 10,000 Rwandan civilians shortly before this. So that weighed heavily in my mind. So when Gaddafi was saying that his forces were going to go into Benghazi and kill every man of an age that could go into the military, we believed he really was going to do that. And it was really very nerve-wracking for us, if you will, that from the time they passed the UN resolution, we really felt like we had to get airborne and turn Gaddafi's forces around, which were headed towards Benghazi the very next day. or else they'd get into Benghazi, they would start killing civilians, and then we'd have a bigger challenge because of the urban fighting that would take place.
Okay. And ma'am, I know you mentioned in one of our previous conversations, because of Gaddafi's speed and pushing into Benghazi, that forced kind of veering off doctrine for the JATC cycle and the ATO cycle, and you had the rebellion of the mappers. So you might go into that a little bit.
Yeah, what Lincoln is talking about is, the timeline is just so tight. And if you think about it, and I know you guys are learning this here in school, the cycle, the ATO cycle, and the process that that takes place, whether you want to talk about the 48-hour ATO cycle combined with the 96-hour entire planning cycle. Because we were told to that we were going to go enact this UN past security resolution, and we knew that we had to do it as quickly as possible, we knew we really didn't have time that you normally would to go through that entire process. So I told the planning staff that we're going to truncate that time period, and I like to call it the revolt of my map cell. The map cell basically, melted down and said, we can't do this, and this is dangerous, and this is something we can't do, and I literally had to go sit down with all of them and say, I understand what doctrine is, I understand what the normal cycle is, and I've got it, and I understand that by shortening that up, that we incur a great deal of risk. I got that. But I also know that if we don't do it on those abbreviated timelines, that Gaddafi's forces are going to be in Benghazi before we even get airborne. And then we're going to incur a great deal more risk, not to mention the chances of our mission not succeeding. So in my estimation as the JFACC, it was worth truncating that process and risking success in that way versus the huge risk to success and loss of life that I thought would happen if we extended it. And ultimately, when we sat down and discussed it, the MAP guys, to give them full credit, they said, "Got it, ma'am. We'll do it," and they launched into it and did what they had to do to make it happen. They even produced the ATO monkey, if you will, at the end of the thing and gave it to me, and it's the monkey they used to throw across the room that screams, every time the ATO was produced, and that scared me, and I was really glad that I didn't know until that moment that that's the way they produced the ATO. But another challenge was in generations. We needed to generate forces, and initially Italy wouldn't let us bring weapons into country and wouldn't let us upload, so we couldn't generate for combat forces on the timeline we wanted to in Italy. So for the first night, what we actually had to do was we had to generate forces in England and fly the Strike Eagles from England, have them execute to deploy, in essence. So they took off from England, dropped their weapons in Libya, and then landed in Italy. As you can imagine, that's not the way we would normally want to operate, but we were driven to that by the timelines and by some of the constraints. And even on those timelines, General Welsh, who was USAF at the time, did not want me to generate when I wanted to start generating. And his concern was that we would tip our hands if we started generating then. And my point was, well, if we don't generate, we're not going to go anywhere. So I actually had to get the AFRICOM commander's guidance and ask USAF to generate.
Okay. Kind of stepping back to the request for forces, so what assets were not available for the initial stages, and what kind of changes or challenges that proposed?
Well, there were, I could probably talk all day about what wasn't available, but the key things we didn't have, we ourselves had a very small AOC in 17th Air Force that we had been executing ops for a long time, but limited RPA ops. In fact, the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs said AFRICOM was actually the second most kinetic AOR on the globe before Libya happened, but most people just didn't know that. But those were obviously very different and demanded a different specialty and a smaller AOC. So we had originally in the planning phases combined our AOC and 603rd, which is the USAF AOC, and we're working together with the two of those. But each of those AOCs alone and even together were not big enough to handle an operation of this size. So in addition to those two AOCs coming together, we pulled from each of our augmenting guard units from Syracuse for the 603rd and from Battle Creek, Michigan for us. And so we literally kludged 4 AOCs together within 48 hours of combat operations. And by the way, those guard guys never got authorization. They came over on their own, and we had to fight for months after that to get them paid, literally, for what they did. They were real heroes. We didn't have the J-Stars, which we desperately needed for the type of operations we were doing at the time. We didn't have AWACS, which we really needed for command and control. So I had to use the ships in the Mediterranean, Red Crown, for command and control operations. We had to set up very different ROE than we had been using in Iraq and Afghanistan for so long. And that really, confused the crews because we didn't have those command and control assets. We gave them, in essence, kill boxes and had them do SCAR in each of those kill boxes, and we set up ROE that basically gave the pilots in the cockpit the responsibility to determine what the collateral damage estimate was for within their target box, if you will. And then when they assess that CDE, collateral damage estimate, depending on how high that was, if it was low enough, then they could make the decision and they could engage and drop their weapons. If it was at a certain level, it came to me and I would make that determination. And if it was really high, it would go to the Joint Force Commander to make that call. That was just something we had to do based on the limited resources. But it was something so different that our pilots were not used to doing in our other two conflicts, that we were literally getting phone calls saying, hey, you wrote the ROE wrong. And my poor strategy chief had to sit down with each of the woes at each of the wings and tell them, no, honest to God, this is what we mean, because this is the way we have to do this or we can't be successful. My biggest fear in the resources we didn't have at the beginning was a lack of CSAR assets. And our commitment, obviously, as everyone knows, is to make sure our air crews know that they have CSAR available and ready if something should go wrong. We didn't have anything. So I had to pull my PJs from Djibouti, pull them out of there and put them in, and then USAF loaned me some helicopters from Mildenhall. We brought those together, but that was on the second night of the war before I could get the helicopters. So they had just finished deploying, literally, when our Strike Eagle went down. And so they had just put in a 16-hour day as PJs and helicopter crew. So my decision was, we have an air crew down, you have committed CSAR assets that have been already engaged for 16 hours today, and we have an alternative, which is MV-22s off the Kearsarge, which are not dedicated. They're not real CSAR forces, but they're trap. So we could use them, and I was given timelines for how long it would take to constitute the UH-60s and how long it would take to constitute the MV-22s. So I had to choose to go with the MV-22s, and my PJs never, ever forgave me for that. I was afraid they were going to push me out of the helicopter next time I was in Djibouti without a chute. But thankfully that all worked out well, but not having an injured pilot or Wizzo in that made that okay, but there could have been a lot of circumstances where that would have been a real issue.
Okay. I'd like to go more into that in a second. If we could step back to the ROEs. Being you didn't come from tactical background or a fighter or bomber, do you think you got more pushback from the fighter folks?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I never felt that way. You know, my strategy chief said that he was often asked afterwards, you know, what was it like to work for a JFAC, you know, who wasn't a fighter pilot, and he said, actually, I really liked it because she listened. And I think, but I think the point there is that I think we all have in our bag of tricks preconceived notions, whether we want to accept that or not. And I think it almost helped me to not have as many in some cases. I had not been focusing on the ROE that we'd been operating with in Iraq and Afghanistan. So it was, I think, in some cases easier for me to say, okay, well, we can go down this path. And I don't think the pushback was necessarily, you know, that I was the JFAC. It was really, the pushback was like, wow, this is something that we haven't been doing, you know, and a lack of comfort. And I don't blame the crews. You know, we were throwing them stuff, you know, they were getting spins at the last minute, you know, so they had a lot, very, very minimal time to study. And then we're throwing ROE at them. That was, I think, probably pretty surprising. But, you know, amazingly enough, you know, they handled it expertly, and all of our allies too, if you think of that, you know, they were operating with our ROE at the time and our spins and just doing a phenomenal job.
Speaking of allies, ma'am, can you explain how the coalition came to kind of comprise itself and what kind of challenges that presented?
Yeah, you know, I think we were talking earlier about how, you know, you got to be honest about the mistakes you make, and you know, we don't have enough time in the month for me to go over the mistakes I made, but one of the bigger ones I think that was interesting is I never envisioned a coalition action. You know, everything that we had been planning for, everything we'd been talking about, everything we'd been thinking was a unilateral U.S. engagement. So all of our plans involved that, and then surprisingly enough for me, I probably should have anticipated it, but it was literally the night before, the day before combat ops, where I got a phone call from my British counterpart saying, hey, I got a 1-star I'm going to send you, you know, tomorrow, you know, can you work with them? And then my French counterpart came as well. So I literally sat around the desk in my office, you know, my little conference table with the two of them, the Brit 1-star and the French 2-star, and pulled out my target list, you know, had the my Brit give me his target list, and deconflicted, literally sitting there at my conference table, and made a decision on what to double tap, what to hit twice, what to change in our plans. Based on what they were doing. And then the only thing I could do on that short notice was deconflict in time. So what I ultimately did was say, okay, you know, what we'll do is, you know, we have to take down the IADs first. So, you know, we'll do that piece of it, and then we set blocks of times for the rest of the engagement between the Brits, the French, and us, and that worked really successfully, I think. But it became even more challenging as more allies rolled in. I mean, in fact, we got a phone call from a formation of F-16s from Norway. They called our AOC on the radio and said, hey, we're airborne, where do you want us to land? We're joining your coalition. That's the first time we ever even considered Norway joining the coalition. And then they showed up at my desk with a letter from their Secretary of Defense opconning all of their F-16s to me. So that was an interesting time. But you know, the great news is that because we work together, you know, whether it's environments here where you all are going to school together and learning about how we plan, you know, together, or whether it's our you know, operational red flags, all the exercises that we do joint or coalition-wise, we were able to come together on that short notice and do just fine because we all understood how we operated together. And I'll be honest with you, all of those senior national reps accepted the fact I was never officially designated the CFACC. I was the JFAC. And because we weren't an official coalition, but they all accepted that I was acting as the CFACC because, not me personally, but because we as the US at the time had the capacity to do that. So when it came to sitting around the table and doing looking at the strategy, instead of, there being 13 different people sitting around and talking about it, it was 13 different countries talking to the CFACC and me setting the priorities with their inputs. So it worked out amazingly well. The biggest challenge was interoperability and being able to communicate with each other on a good basis. But they were really amazing, and the Qataris were really phenomenal. They came in, and I'll never forget when the colonel came to me and said, "Okay, we're going to fly into Tobruk with our C-17 tomorrow." And I said, no, we don't know what's happening in Tobruk right now, and we don't think it's safe there, and I wouldn't take in a mobility aircraft in there right now. And he's like, "Yeah, I understand, but what could I do, and it ended up being a great thing because they were able to get equipment and things to the civilian populace, the rebels, and to the rebel forces that we couldn't do, and it worked out really well.
All right, ma'am. I'd like to step back to the F-15. I know it got lost. I was wondering if you could describe the mission it was on and kind of the steps you had to take to recover the aircrew.
Yeah, sure. This was the second night, and we had made a decision when we took down the IADs, the air defenses in Libya. They had 5 major SAMs, SA-5s, that blanketed their country. And there was one up by Benghazi that covered the northeast area, which is where the rebels were based. And we had long debates back and forth about, do we take down that SA-5 or not? We really were trying to maintain infrastructure where we could, so Libya would have that in the future. We wanted to give the rebels, if they needed that SA-5 to help them see incoming Libyan traffic, we wanted to be able to use that. So the first night we opted not to take it out, and we were not able to have any communications with the rebels, so we weren't able to tell them if we were going to take it out the first night. We weren't able to tell them that we weren't striking them and have that kind of conversation, so we had opted not to. But by the second night, there was a lack of we were uncomfortable enough with what was going on and how close Gaddafi forces were up towards where that SA-5 was, that we decided that, yeah, we better take that out so that they're not able to reconstitute it. So we decided to go in there, and there was the big service rivalry about, or I shouldn't say big service rivalry, but the different ideas about, do we use another TLAM to take it out, which is what I had used on the other SA-5s, or do we go in there with a manned asset? I was perfectly happy to use the TLAMs. I don't care how much they cost, It was cheap overall, the war, really. But there was a big push, I'll say, from the Air Force side to send in a manned aircraft to drop on it, and I didn't care enough, so I said, okay, we'll do that. I'll tell you, in the first few moments after that aircraft went down, I was feeling pretty bad about making that decision. But I think either decision was fine in either case. That F-15 could have gone down no matter what its target was, obviously. But so when at first they come running into my office and say, I think it was like about 10 o'clock at night, and I was getting ready to head home after being there since about 4 or 5 that morning probably, but. And so I ran to the AOC floor, and all of our senior national reps from the other coalitions decided to stay and watch the way we did our CSAR operations, and that was really good to have them sit and watch the whole thing unfold. And it was really amazing for me to watch how our CSAR forces work together, and whether it was talking to the pilot, who radios in right away, and giving him good advice, even simple advice like get upwind of the dogs that you can hear barking, so that they can't find you. And they're giving him this direct advice, where you had to go E&E on your own. This guy's getting advice from the experts at real time, and that was impressive to watch. The real challenge at the beginning was we were in contact with the pilot, but we didn't have any contact with the EWO. So we were really, or the WISO, we were really worried about, what his status was. The pilot felt really uncomfortable. He was hearing the dogs that I mentioned barking. He was hearing gunfire. His real thought, and we really didn't know what the situation on the ground was well enough to know if these were Gaddafi forces looking for him, whether they were rebel forces that were willing to help him, or rebel forces that were, just pissed that they had dropped a weapon on their SA-5. And we're going to take him out either way. So that was a really nerve-wracking time, not knowing. The pilot was obviously very uncomfortable, and as folks started getting closer and closer to him, he started asking for us to lay down strafing fire, which the F-16 Flying Cap did. And then we had some Harriers roll in, and they literally started dropping 200-pounders to try and push back what they thought might be Gaddafi forces. I was really uncomfortable with that because I knew I had a WISO on the ground down there, and I didn't know where he was, and I really didn't feel comfortable with us somewhat indiscriminately dropping those 200-pound bombs. So I had to, make the order to withhold. So our MV-22 forces got in there and were able to direct the pilot to a recovery site, went in, picked him up. We got the EP-3s, the joint ops that we do are so amazing. It was our Navy EP-3 that was ultimately able to pick up the radio transmissions from the WISO and get him sort of in communication. And then we were not allowed to have any contact with any of the Libyan forces. That was part of our initial ROE, if you will, from the strategic guidance side. But there was a little inroad with our CIA guys on the ground. And so I couldn't be in that loop, if you will, but they worked to pick up the WISO who we found. So my favorite story of the whole campaign was they actually had a rebel pull up in a pickup truck, picked up this WISO. They got him in the pickup truck. The WISO's listening to this 1980s music on the radio, going, man, this is just too bizarre for words. He's terrified. He has no idea who this individual is that just picked him up, who hands him a phone and says, here. So he starts talking on the phone. Well, it turns out this is the American embassy in absentia that's in Germany, and they're literally talking to this WISO and saying, trust the guy next to you. He's part of the rebel forces. He's going to take you to Benghazi, blah, blah, blah. But they're trying to keep him on the phone. They're also trying to keep him relaxed. And at one point, he gets handed off, or the phone on the other side gets handed off to the ambassador's secretary. So she gets on the phone and she's like, okay, so Tyler, is this your first time? He's like, this is too bizarre and very, very weird. But that, and then when I went into Libya the next year, or not the next year, shortly thereafter, was that April 12? I guess it was. But when I went into Libya, and the air chief of the new Libyan forces hosted me, and we're driving around, and they were talking about, gosh, we think you guys are just unbelievable. We can't believe, what you were able